to be here. I always really enjoy these events, and it's an honor to speak at this anniversary event. Continuing the theme of Professor Smar's talk, I'm going to focus on how you can leverage recent advances in our understanding of biological rhythms to optimize your health and performance. To begin, consider our lives in the context of the history of our species. Simplistically, humans once lived by two clocks, and one of these was the environmental clock, predictable changes in factors such as light and temperature each 24 hours. To thrive in these changing environments, organisms evolved their own biological clocks to anticipate and adapt to these environments, optimizing biology and hence behavior according to the time of day. The clocks of these people were probably tightly synchronized with the environmental clock, and during the daytime, these people would have been physically active to gather food and water, whereas at night, with light only coming from firelight, starlight, and moonlight, these people would have mostly rested and fasted. But then things changed, and artificial lighting now not only disrupts our biological clocks, but also enables waking behaviors such as eating at times of day at which our clocks are promoting sleep. Not only that, we've systematically engineered physical activity out of our lives, and now we barely need to move to have access to food at any time that we desire. So, in our 24/7 society, people can now work round the clock, and a third clock influences our lives more and more, and that is the social clock. Shift work is an obvious example of the perils of living against our biological clocks. And about 15 to 20% of all workers work night shifts. Night shifts are associated with an increased risk of various diseases, from diabetes to obesity, to coronary heart disease, to stroke. And while it's not possible to say that it's just biological clock disruption that leads these people to an increased risk of these diseases, carefully controlled experiments have shown that biological clock disruption is a direct cause of metabolic health problems and poor cognitive performance in people. You've probably experienced this yourself acutely during jet lag, and I want to focus on how you can improve the function of your body's clocks so that you can avoid these consequences. And I know that Ben focused on individual differences between people. What I'm going to discuss is what you generally see in most people. You're probably familiar with the concept of chronotype, and chronotype is individual differences between people in behaviors that are regulated by the circadian system, the most obvious of which is the timing of the sleep-wake cycle. One manifestation of biological clock disruption in our modern environments is an amplified range of chronotypes between people. And now, if you look at the earlier sleepers versus the later sleepers, then whereas some people prefer to go to bed at 7 p.m., others prefer to go to bed at 7 a.m. The most robust marker of your chronotype is the timing of your melatonin rhythm. And melatonin is a hormone that's synthesized by the pineal gland in the brain during darkness. So in this way, it's an internal signal of darkness. For most people, the biological nighttime, when melatonin is high, begins about 2 hours before sleep onset, and it ends around the time at which you would naturally wake up each day. But if you and the person next to you were both to measure your melatonin rhythms, then what you would realize is that your 8 p.m. isn't necessarily the other person's 8 p.m. And this measure of the timing of your circadian system informs you of your circadian time. And it's really important to understand your circadian time if you want to improve your health and performance. There have been some nice experiments of people who go camping that show that one of the reasons for this big disparity between people is the presence of weak time cues. So in this experiment, people went camping in the Rocky Mountains for several days. And at the beginning of the experiment, there was a wide dispersion of chronotypes. However, during this time, when these people were only exposed to natural light, whereas before the experiment began, the difference in the mid-sleep time of the earliest and the latest sleepers was about 4 hours. After only a few days, the difference in the timing of their sleep was less than 1 hour. So the presence of strong Zeitgebers, or time cues, which are the cues that resynchronize our biological clocks each day, narrowed the range of chronotypes and is important for you if you wish to feel and perform better. We have a master clock in our brains that primarily influences the timing of our sleep-wake cycles. And this clock is mostly set by our patterns of exposure to light and dark. Daytime physical activity is important to setting the timing of the clocks in many of your tissues. And recent experiments have shown that meal timing seems to be especially important in setting the timing of the clocks outside of the master clock in your brain. So having regular, consistently timed cycles of feeding and fasting seems to bolster the function of your biological clocks. I mentioned earlier that circadian time is important, but it's only important when considered relative to Zeitgeber time. Basically, during the biological daytime, you want to expose yourself to lots of high-intensity blue light, which you get outside, it's quite dark in here. You want to be physically active, and you want to confine your intake of calories and water to this time. And then at night, you want minimal light exposure, you want to be inactive, and you want to fast. Circadian time and Zeitgeber time interact, and this interaction can be plotted using so-called phase response curves. And you needn't worry about what these are, but the key principle is that if you expose yourself to very strong time cues early in your biological day, then you'll tend to shift relevant biological rhythms earlier, whereas if you expose yourself to strong time cues late in the biological day, then you'll tend to shift them later. So, for example, were you to go and do some high-intensity exercise in the presence of strong blue light 1 hour before bedtime, then you would tend to delay your biological clock and thereby the timing of your sleep too. Regardless of your chronotype, one characteristic of a healthy circadian system is consistently timed, high-amplitude rhythms of wakefulness and rest. And these rhythms can be simplistically modeled by the interaction of two processes. One of these is a sleep process, which is depicted here as the blue line. And this is intuitive. The longer that you've been awake each day, the greater the pressure there is for you to sleep. And then around the time at which you go to bed each evening, this process is paid off when you fall asleep. The other process is this process in black, which is a circadian rhythm in wakefulness. And basically, the longer that you've been awake during the biological day, the greater the pressure there is to stay awake, opposing the accumulating pressure to sleep. And then around the time at which you would go to bed at night, a sudden drop in this wakefulness process no longer opposes the sleep process, resulting in a strong urge to sleep. At lunchtime, you often have this so-called post-lunch slump. And interestingly, that's probably not strongly related to eating lunch. It's actually because of a temporary dip in the wakefulness drive at this time of day. So if you're not a shift worker and you habitually nap or otherwise must nap, for example, if you're sleepy and you're going driving, then this is often a prime time to nap. After sleep loss, naps can have numerous positive effects, from an increase in immune function to a boost in exercise performance to improved memory consolidation, and also a freeing of the capacity for you to learn new things. And to realize these benefits, a nap of about 10 minutes tends to have those consequences, but also produce a strong short-term boost in alertness. And longer naps will have a greater longer-term boost in alertness, and also potentially stronger effects on memory formation. The problem is that if you have a longer nap that contains deep sleep, then you'll tend to feel a bit groggy afterwards, and the nap is also more likely to interfere with your sleep later that evening. The presence of the lunchtime dip in wakefulness is probably related to the fact that at this time of day, the sun is strongest. So it would have been adaptive for us to escape the sun's damaging UV rays at this time. And this is one example of how temperature affects sleep. But you can also leverage an understanding of how temperature affects us to improve your sleep. And a simple way to do this would be to have a 10-minute shower at about 40 degrees Celsius around 1 hour before your planned bedtime. And doing this will raise the temperature of the skin on your extremities by a couple of degrees, which perhaps counterintuitively will then help you radiate heat out from your core, thereby falling asleep faster. And if you put your socks on afterwards, that will also help with this too. The optimal bedroom temperature seems to be about 18 degrees Celsius for most people. And you want to pick a mattress that effectively dissipates heat. Spring mattresses are better than foam mattresses for this. That's an error on the slides. I'm sorry, it should have been updated. But you can also play with mattress topper temperature technologies, such as the ChiliPad or the Oola. The lunchtime dip in wakefulness is perhaps the most salient example of how our biological clocks influence our cognitive function. But these clocks influence numerous cognitive processes, as does how long we've been awake each day. And in general, the longer that you've been awake, the worse your attention is likely to be. So in a way, it makes sense to put your most focused cognitive work relatively early in your biological day. Ego depletion is the idea that willpower is a finite resource. So you're more likely to make poor decisions when you've already had to make lots of decisions that day, which, if true, would also suggest that putting your most focused activities early in your day would be best. Whether ego depletion actually exists is contentious, but for numerous reasons, I still think that it makes sense for most people to put the most difficult work early in the biological day. Next, cognitive load is the mental effort that's involved in doing a particular task, and numerous factors influence cognitive load. Examples of this are the complexity of the task, the quality of the instruction, the presence of time pressure in which to do the task, use of multimedia, and most of those things you can't really influence. But one thing that you can influence is task switching. So if you're doing very focused, deep work, then it makes sense to keep your phone on airplane mode, preferably in a different room. And you might also benefit from website blocking apps such as Self-Control or Freedom on your computer. Interestingly, sleep difficulties are most common at the start of the working week, and much of this relates to rumination about work. And there are two simple strategies that I suggest that you try to circumvent this. One, as has been mentioned earlier, is to stop doing work and also stop using electronic devices such as phones and computers at least 1 hour before your bedtime. And I'd also wait until the time that you need to be up in the morning to turn those back on. If you wake up at night, please don't turn your phone on. The other is to make a to-do list within 2 hours or so of bedtime for the next day. And think of this as a way to offload tasks from your mind. Then I would keep the notebook that you use for that by your bedside in case you wake up at night with something on your mind which might otherwise interfere with your sleep. And this particular task has been shown to help people fall asleep faster during transient bouts of insomnia. Work-related stress can also be ameliorated using meditation. And for many people, meditation helps them sleep better. Difficulty is that lots of people struggle to turn meditation into a habit. And that's one of the reasons that I suggest that you meditate within 2 hours of waking up each day. The other is just that meditation tends to help people better navigate upcoming stresses. If you're new to meditation, then the Waking Up app by Sam Harris has a very good introductory course that you should check out. For most people, I think it makes sense to schedule psychologically stressful events during the middle of the biological day. Obviously, you can't always influence when these are going to occur, but if you can, then that's probably optimal. If they're too late at night, that will likely interfere with your sleep. If they're too early in your morning, then the cardiovascular system is most responsive or reactive to stress at this time of day. And that cardiovascular reactivity is one of the reasons that events such as heart attacks tend to cluster in the morning. And this reactivity is actually amplified by cognitive load too. And this cardiovascular reactivity is one reason that it makes sense to avoid very strenuous exercise around the time that you wake up each day. The other reason relates to the integrity of your spine. Each night, when your spine is unloaded, the discs between your vertebrae rehydrate. And the positive side of this is that you wake up taller, which is a bonus. But the negative side of that is that, like pumped up balloons, these discs are now more prone to herniation when placed under load. So avoid very heavy loading of the spine around the time that you wake up each day, especially if you take your spine to end range of motion. If you're interested in strength and power, then the best time of day to do this type of exercise seems to be in the late biological afternoon. And a primary reason for this is that your core body temperature is generally highest at this time of day. This has numerous consequences. One of them is that the signals that are sent through your nerves are transmitted faster at higher temperatures. Another is that the enzymes that provide your muscles with energy work faster at higher temperatures. Another is that the synovial fluid in your joints is less viscous at higher temperatures. And as a result of all these things, strength and power tends to be highest at this time of day. And if anything, training at this time of day also seems to lead to greater adaptations to strength and power training. The best time of day at which to do endurance training seems to be quite dependent on the individual. And for this reason, if you're an endurance athlete, then you should experiment with different times of day. Interestingly, if you look at your daily variation in your peak oxygen uptake, or VO2 max, then the amplitude of that variation is about twice the size of the variation of VO2 max from one day to the next, suggesting that it is important to optimize this. It's just something that you're going to have to experiment with. But maybe you're exercising to improve your metabolic health. If that's the case, you might use high-intensity intermittent training. And there's been some nice work recently looking at the effects of high-intensity intermittent cycling on blood sugar regulation. And in short, what they found was that among people who have type 2 diabetes, doing high-intensity intermittent cycling at 8 a.m. actually led to worse blood sugar regulation. However, doing it at 4 p.m. in the afternoon improved blood sugar regulation. As a rule of thumb, regardless of the type of exercise that you're doing, I would confine exercise the period between 1 hour after you habitually wake up and 3 hours before your habitual bedtime, if possible. But obviously, sex doesn't count. Optimizing exercise timing is key to blood sugar regulation, but so is optimizing diet timing. And one reason for this is that oral glucose tolerance is about 17% higher in the biological morning than in the biological evening. And if you look at people who have poor blood sugar regulation, then when they consume carbohydrate-rich meals early in the day, their average blood sugar levels are lower. Optimizing diet timing and placing lots of calories and carbohydrates early in the day also seems to be good for metabolic health in general. And one reason for this is that you'll burn more calories after consuming a meal in the biological morning than you will after the very same meal in the biological evening. And in this study, overweight and obese women were divided into two groups for 12 weeks. One of the groups consumed half their calories at breakfast, and the other group consumed half their calories at dinner. And after 12 weeks, the early eaters who had 50% of their calories at breakfast lost more than twice as much body weight, more than twice as many centimeters off their waists, and had greater improvements in blood sugar and blood lipids. And recently, similar findings have been reported among adults who have type 2 diabetes. There's been a lot of interest of late in the concept of time-restricted eating, and this generally entails confining all of your calories to a period of 12 hours or less each day. And as one example of the beneficial effects of timing this well, there was a study of adult men who have pre-diabetes who went through 2 periods. And in one period, they consumed all of their calories between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. And in the other period, they consumed all of them between 8 a.m. and 2 p.m., so-called early time-restricted eating. And after early time-restricted eating, they had better insulin sensitivity, lower measures of oxidative stress, which is a telltale proxy of aging, and a dramatic drop in morning blood pressure. If you consume a relatively small proportion of your calories late in the day, it also seems to be good for your sleep. But it's not just about the timing of your calories and carbohydrates within the day, it's also the sequence in which you consume calories at meals. And this is something that isn't really ever discussed, but there's been some really nice work looking at adults who have poor blood sugar control. And in short, what you find is that if you consume protein and fiber-rich foods before you consume carbohydrate-rich foods at a given meal, then you will tend to have dramatically lower post-meal swings in your blood sugar, which over time you'd expect to lead to lower risk of diabetes. And the magnitude of this effect is quite substantial. It seems to be similar to the effect of anti-diabetic medications. Having a regular diet is also important, and people who consume a fixed number of meals each day tend to burn more calories after eating, have better blood sugar regulation, and better appetite control too. So as a rule of thumb, confine your caloric period to 6 to 12 hours each day, wait at least 30 minutes after your habitual wake time before consuming breakfast, and finish your final calories of the day at least 2 hours before your bedtime. Wait 3 to 6 hours between meals, and it generally makes sense to front load your calorie and carbohydrate intake, but if you do high intensity exercise later in your biological day, then don't be afraid to consume many of your calories and carbohydrates around the exercise bout. At individual events, consume carbohydrate-rich items last, and being consistent from one day to the next seems to be important to metabolic health. If you value your sleep, then you need to use stimulants judiciously. And as a rule of thumb, I would suggest consuming no more than 2 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body mass per day, capping your intake by at least 9 hours before your bedtime. And you can use the website Caffeine Informer to estimate your caffeine intake. Caffeine brings us to the subject of drugs. And in recent years, there have been big developments in the study of chronopharmacology. And a key concept here is that how our bodies absorb, distribute, metabolize, and excrete drugs varies dramatically over the course of the biological day, which means that optimizing the timing of your medication could substantially affect the consequences of you taking that medication. And for some drugs, optimizing timing of medication can have really substantial effects. So it could double the efficacy of some drugs and improve their tolerability by as much as 5-fold. And this has been shown for medications for cancer and rheumatoid arthritis most strongly. So next time you get prescribed something by your doctor, you may want to ask if there's a best time of day at which to pop your pills. And I should add that this is probably very relevant to many supplements too. I'll mention one other thing here that I think is fascinating. And I alluded earlier to the idea that diet timing is very important to setting the timing of clocks in many of our tissues, one of which is the liver. And the timing of the liver clock is very relevant to drug metabolism because the liver is important in detoxifying drugs. So what some people have found is that if you shift the timing at which mice have access to food, then you shift the timing of their liver's clocks. And in doing so, you change the time at which drugs are most toxic to the mice. And this has been shown for acetaminophen or paracetamol. So the time at which you consume drugs the time at which you eat may also be an important determinant of your responses to taking medications. I hope it's now clear that giving your body strong time cues is important to boosting the function of your body's clocks and optimizing your health and performance. But I should note that occasional departures from these regular rhythms probably aren't a bad thing, and in some cases might be beneficial. And fasting exemplifies this, because prolonged fasting tends to actually flatten some of our biological rhythms, which sounds like a bad thing. But we, of course, know that prolonged fasting can be very beneficial for many people, especially people who have lots of fat to lose, for example. And this exemplifies an important concept, and that's that intermittent exposure to an appropriate dose of a stressful, subtoxic stimulus can trigger biological defense mechanisms that result in the repair and enhancement of biological systems. And this just means that occasional use of fasting, cold exposure, sauna use, and novel types of exercise is likely to be very beneficial for your health and performance. So if nothing else, I hope that you remember that it's not only what you do that matters, but when you do it is critical too. I hope you found this useful. If you want any help with your health and performance, then feel free to say hi here or reach out to me online. And thank you very much for your attention.